Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I hope I'm going live about now. I definitely did not quite expect to be streaming today because I thought, well, what can Mark Gurman really say? Well, he gave us a pretty decent summary of what's to come this year. So I guess I'm back. And then throughout the next coming week, I expect me to be streaming my own impressions, hopefully on Friday. Hopefully, if nothing goes wrong with my iPhone purchase, that has gone through quite well on Friday. It's promised for the 19th of September, so I guess we'll have to see. We'll also have more benchmarks, as of course more devices are being tested, and more devices are being tested without being really very much subject to like having a lot of background tasks running, because that's what usually happens when you get a new device. It first has to go through a lot of background tasks, download your data, index it and shit like that. People test out cameras, keep a lot of apps open, and that can impact benchmarks. Not to say that it really should, given how iOS manages RAM, but to a degree it's absolutely understandable, and best benchmarking practice absolutely requires you to close other background tasks. But well, so we have benchmarks, we have some outlook by Mark Gurman, and we have some details on the iPhone 17 series. So today is a pretty short and sweet one. We might even look into what Drew from Tailosive Tech has to say about the iPhone, not 17 Air, just iPhone Air. Always forget that. So plenty of stuff for us to go through, and of course plenty of stuff for us to get excited about what's going to be coming next week. First, and this is something that I already left in the chat, guys, please consider if Discord as an app will ever fucking work, because God forbid. So this is Discord. Feel free to join our Discord. We actually have a lot of great stuff, not just completely off-the-cuff discussions, but for example, Jimmy James is posting currently a lot of benchmarks. He's usually first on Geekbench. He has a tool that analyzes the data coming from there. We even have some people who have made Geekbench itself. So plenty of exciting stuff. Please go over there. Please enjoy it. Of course, if you want to support this channel, subscribe, like, share, comment. You know all the YouTube jazz drill by now. You can also support this channel directly through super chats and super stickers by becoming a channel member or by becoming a Patreon supporter. Shout out to Jonathan, Max, Angelica, Steve, and Benveni, our MacBook Pro Max supporters across YouTube and Patreon. I apologize for needing 5 extra minutes before the stream actually started. I had some mild technical issues to deal with, mainly internet related. My Wi-Fi has really been acting up strange, which has really not worked too well with the beta versions of iOS on my iPhone. But that's a slightly different discussion. I'm gonna just reboot my internet for a little bit, my router, and then obviously once iOS 26, the official version, comes out, we'll have to see how my 15 Pro fares on that, and then later on how my 17 Pro Max, of course, performs on my Wi-Fi 6 router. So don't expect any big benchmark or analysis from me about Wi-Fi 7 performance or stuff like that. It's my only Wi-Fi 7 device, even if I were to test out technologies like AirDrop. My iPhone 15 Pro Max would be the closest device, I guess, with a Wi-Fi 6E connection. Then my MacBook is Wi-Fi 6. My iPad is Wi-Fi 6. I don't have issues with them based on the underlying technology. Could their modems and antennas be a little bit faster, especially once I get further away from my router? Sure. But in the same way, I can also actually claim that it's just the fault of the router. So that's an entirely different discussion. Before we get into any of our own stuff, so the Geekbench benchmarks, what they mean potentially, I would like to go into what Mark Gurman has posted. And speaking of technical issues that I had before, I was not able to log into my Bloomberg account. I was sending that email because you can create like accounts on Bloomberg without passwords. So usually it just sends you a code and then you type it in based on the email, and it refused to send the code even though my email was written in perfectly. So I guess Mark Gurman, I am giving you money, so maybe contact me on how to fix this, or I'll just fix it after like rebooting the website a few times. Who knows? Maybe they're having some technical issues on a Sunday. But the main gist of what Mark Gurman has posted, beyond some ramblings, of course, on the iPhone 17 series, because, well, that's also part of his job. Even though we kind of think of him as just the leaker guy, he definitely also, like, well, he doesn't really review devices, but he kind of gives his 2 cents, which I guess makes sense. I'm kind of a leaker analysis guy, but from time to time I'll also post my own review, or at least my own impressions. So that's nothing against Mark Gurman, but it's also the far less interesting portion of the article, that newsletter. That being said, he has given us some concrete outlook on what to expect this year, or at least around like Q1 of 2026. So some of these devices are not going to be launching in 2025, most likely, but they should be launching pretty early in the next year. So if you're excited about any of them, if you're considering purchasing, like what at that point will be their predecessors, maybe keep an eye out on that. Riley saying, hello Mark, another day, another Yap session. Well, that's the cycle of Yap. That's the Yap life, you know it, Riley. Thank you so much for joining as always. Thank you so much for supporting. Let's look into what we have left for 2025 and early 2026. First is the M5 Mac Pro, iPad Pro, I apologize. Well, maybe Mac Pro too, but it's not in here. The M5 iPad Pro makes a lot of sense. We've heard rumorings about it for now half a year or so. The last iPad, the M4 iPad Pro, well, the last Pro iPad, of course, came out in May of last year. So if you normalize it to a roughly 18-month cycle, it makes sense that by the end of 2025, we should be getting some upgraded iPad Pro. We do not have too many details about this iPad, which might reflect the fact that there aren't even that many changes. Don't forget, we just got the redesigned M4 iPad Pro, which is thinner, lighter, has a tandem OLED screen, right? But there's a lot of things that we can now kind of surmise based on what we have seen from the iPhone 17 event. First, of course, is the M5 chip itself. Now, this is actually something that is worth bringing up Geekbench again. And no, I have not forgotten that I have Geekbench already open, because I think I'll need quite a few Geekbench windows by the end of the stream. Getting to iOS benchmark charts. Guys, we have quite a few people watching right now. Please subscribe, please like, please share this video, please comment. I love interacting with a lively comment section, getting your agreements, your disagreements, and just liking helps attract new people to the stream, helps us grow the community. We've had, as I mentioned in the beginning, we have more people coming in as subscribers. We had more people coming in into the Discord, so that helps tremendously. So we have the M4 iPad Pro here coming in at around 3,700 points in Geekbench 6. I've seen some results even closer to 3,800, which does make sense because the M4 Pro, M4 Max, they're clocked a little bit higher and then give you roughly 4,000 points. So how high is this clocked? At 4.4 gigahertz. So yeah, that makes sense that they would be roughly 5% faster. We also have close to 14,000 points. Well, I'm actually, yeah, we have 14,000 points in multi-core or around that. So expect uplifts similar to what we've seen on the iPhone, going from the A18 to the A19, but of course there is always some questions about like, will Apple give the M5 the same cooling uplift on the iPad Pro as, for example, the A19 Pro powered iPhone 17 Pro and Pro Max are getting, right? So will Apple have to adjust some of that? The iPhone got like a 200 megahertz boost, like a little bit higher than that. Maybe this will get another 200, maybe 300-ish megahertz, just as like a percentage of the overall performance. Should get this to around 4,200-ish points, maybe 4,300-ish over the iPhone. If it's really clocked like at that point, like closer to 4.7 gigahertz, it should give us up to potentially 4,400 points. I'm saying that based on the fact that the iPhone 17 Pro and Pro Max are in fact hitting over 4,000 points. Yes, these results are outliers, but they absolutely are possible. And you can see that the more results are coming in, the more common it becomes that many tests are way over 3,900. And basically everything is like over 3,800, right? Sure, we've had some early results coming in at like 3,500, 3,600. But to be honest, I think all of these results are basically errors based on improper testing. Your device was potentially heat soaked already, handling background tasks, indexing your data as you just got it and you were just setting it up. So yeah, I'm actually pretty excited. I'm not claiming this is a world-changing amount of performance versus the M4, but hey, just getting even 10% uplift is already quite nice. With multi-core results, it's a little bit more difficult to predict. The iPhone actually got quite a big uplift. We now see results that go up to 11,000, while previously the last iPhone maxed out at somewhere between 9,000 and 9,200-ish. Like, I mean, I can even look it up, right? But iPhone 17, so that should be the 16 Pro, right? You see like results in the 8,800 range. That seems to be the most typical, but then you see still have results over 9,000, and I think you should be having results. Yeah, here's 9,100. But this is actually one of the results that is more likely, even though multi-core tests on Geekbench are still relatively short, the multi-core result is the one most likely to be hit by like thermal limitations, especially if your device has been running something else in the background already, had already some of its potential being used up. All the collective cache of the chip might not be as available as it just the cache that you need to run one single core. So yeah, if the iPhone can get you roughly 22% more performance, I doubt honestly this would be quite the case here, but maybe we see a similar 2,000 points uplift, maybe more like 2,400-ish, 2,500-ish. So getting comfortably over 16,000 points in multi-core, which would be at this point way faster than my M1 Max MacBook Pro that's already coming in below the M4. My MacBook Pro comes in roughly at 12,000 points, like 11,700. So yeah, tech has come quite a long way, even just from 2020 when we had the initial launch of Apple Silicon on Macs. Riley saying the GPU better be good. Well, that's the main point, right? Because the GPU on the M4 maxed out at 54,000 points, and the GPU on the A19 Pro is coming in almost 40% faster than it was on the A18 Pro. So if we just take 54 times 1.4, that would mean we would have over 75,000 points, closer to 76,000 points on the Metal GPU score. However, the M5 is still limited to 10 cores, right? The iPhone has had 6 cores now for a little while. However, when Apple gave the iPhone 6 cores, they did not move the M series of chips, the base M series chip, from 10 cores to 12. In the past, when it was actually quite common for the M series, well, I mean, in the past, M series chips haven't been around for that much, but even if you look before that at the AX series of chips, right? A12X, A10X, A9X, most of them had double the GPU core count of the same generation iPhone processor, right? So will it finally be the time that we get 20% more cores? And will those cores be just as much faster as they seem to be on the A19 Pro versus the A18 Pro, which at that point would result in what? Times 4 times 1.2. That would be over 90,000 points in metal. Now, would that be thermally really that manageable? Yes, if Apple builds in a large, generous vapor chamber inside the iPad Pro. Could that be the case now that they have done so on the iPhone Pro? Sure. Do I think that that will necessarily happen? Well, to be quite honest, I don't think so. I wouldn't be surprised if we saw more GPU cores, but then I would expect all of them to be clocked a little bit lower than the cores on the iPhone, so you wouldn't get like perfect. Well, it already would be more than 2x, right? Because the iPad has other benefits, just like a larger cache amount and everything, more memory than the iPhone. But hey, just exactly doubling the iPhone performance, which currently comes in at around 37,000 points, doubling that at 75,000, that to me sounds good. And well, wait, no. At what does the iPhone come in at? 47,000 points, right? iPhone 18. Don't tell me I've already forgotten the GPU scores. Oh yeah, it comes in at 45,000 points. No, so 90,000 points makes sense as a doubling of the result, of course. But again, Apple would have to give it a more generous GPU with it, more cooling. And given the fact that Apple uses this chip also on like the iPad Air, which at that point, what would they bin it down to? Like to 10 GPU cores? Would still be very, very fast, and for a lot of people it would potentially make no meaningful upgrade to go to the M4 iPad Pro based on that. Would they bin it down to 11 cores, which would really have no real world difference in my opinion, because you could regulate that basically in clock speed. So just saying, don't expect necessarily to see 20% more GPU cores, but it could happen, right? Just because Apple has been so crazy with the GPU performance on the iPhone 17 Pro and 17 Pro Max, I would hope that we might see something similar on the M5. So that's roughly the performance that you can expect. There's also like supposedly a dual portrait camera or a dual selfie camera here, which honestly, seeing now what the iPhone does with the square camera, honestly, I'm not so sure. Because like even Mark Gurman basically or at least people summarizing Mark Gurman are acknowledging, would it really make so much sense now that the iPhone has like this square selfie camera solution that's a pretty wide angle. The iPad already has center stage, but this is a much higher quality center stage solution than the iPad. I hope the lack of thickness on the iPad would limit that selfie camera, because there is no iPhone as thin as the iPad Pro. Even the iPhone Air, which is seemingly thin at its thinnest point, well, its selfie camera is actually connected to the camera bump on the back. So in fact, the actual camera has double the thickness to work with than it would have on the iPad Pro. So I'm not sure how that would play out, if that would be a limiting factor, if it makes more sense to do here a selfie camera and here a selfie camera. Doesn't, like, I've said it before that I think that it wouldn't be too wasteful, because in the grand scheme of things, one extra selfie camera is not gonna make this iPad like wastefully expensive to make or whatever. But it's not a very typical Apple move to basically build in redundancy. Usually Apple will say, look, we've made a more unique solution, and that unique solution, that one will do its job in both portrait and landscape mode. And seeing what they've done on the iPhone with that selfie camera that allows you to shoot portrait and landscape no matter how you hold your phone, and still has all the center stage stuff that the iPad has already offered, like expanding its viewpoint when somebody is coming in from the side to include them in the video or something like that. To me, that honestly makes more sense. Next is the M5 Vision Pro. Mark Gurman in the past has talked about it potentially still using the M4, but honestly, I think that Apple just has a lot of stuff riding on the M5 generation. So if they just fully commit to mass orders of N3P from TSMC, they'll be able to build A19, A19 Pro on it, M5, M5 Pro, M5 Max, and just when chips get a lot more expensive going forward on the 2nm node, on the A16 node, I think at that point it just will be very likely that Apple can use A19 chips, M5 chips as cheaper alternatives, because they're still on TSMC's 3nm FinFET nodes. And still give you much more performance than if they gave you an M3 or an M4, for example, right? Which would actually be not that much cheaper. So it just makes sense for Apple to double down on N3P, the architectural changes of M5 or A19, especially since they're also building that into their servers. Supposedly there's a new chiplet architecture coming based on the M5 generation. We'll have to see how that works. Apple will definitely not be putting simple A19 and M5 chips in there, but maybe some version of the M5 Max, basically like a giant M5 Ultra Extreme solution, but instead of having full dice interconnected, maybe using them more like chiplets, where some parts are just CPUs, some parts are just GPUs, some parts are just neural engines. So I think there's a lot of interesting stuff. And I think it just makes sense for Apple Vision Pro, just as makes sense for the next iPad Pro, just as makes sense for the next MacBook Air, just as it makes sense for the next MacBook Pro to be built on M5. Now, with M5 Vision Pro, we expect it to come probably early next year, but still might launch this year. Who knows? It would definitely be a big upgrade over the current M2. And in terms of changes, not much has been rumored, at least in terms of like visual changes, other than a space black version. And then it would be followed up by a Vision Air and a next generation Vision Pro. So Apple would be targeting thinner, lighter devices, trying to make it cheaper, hopefully, as well, to make it available to a broader audience. So, and hopefully just the fact that Apple now has more mass orders of these devices, has already worked these technologies, even before they make them thinner and lighter and everything. I would hope that Apple would find a way to give us substantially more value. Like, for example, the base level iPhone just jumped from 128 gigabytes of storage to 256. That's at $799. In comparison, the M2 Vision Pro starts at 256 gigabytes at $3,500 and goes up to $3,700 for 500 gigabytes and then $3,900 for 1 terabyte. If Apple still wants to make it start at 3,500, at the very least, they should give us like the full 1 terabyte at that price point. Also, hopefully a little bit more memory to work with, like maybe 24 gigabytes rather than 16. So there is plenty of levers Apple can pull without necessarily having to reduce prices. However, I would still prefer Apple reduced prices. Like, for example, I think pricing it at $29.99 and giving it 512 gigabytes of storage would be a $700 price reduction from the MSRP of the current 512 gigabyte model. And I think that would be quite enough to at least psychologically appeal to people as a much better product. Next is AirTag 2, and we actually do know what they're going to be powered by. We've had, of course, rumors that they would have expanded range and potentially better battery life, maybe a new form factor, though that seems very unlikely at this point. And the reason why we know it is because we actually are getting the chip that is going to be powering AirTag 2, but we are getting it first in something else, which is AirPods Pro 3. Because yes, while AirPods Pro 3 maintain the same H2 chip as the AirPods Pro 2, we think it's the same because the name is the same. Could it be built potentially on a different node or have be at least slightly higher clocked? I don't know. But we know that it does have the U2 chip rather than the U1 chip, so we should expect at least that change in the new AirTags. We have Sashanak joining the stream saying hello. Hello to you as well. Apple TV and HomePod Mini, that one we also know actually what they might be powered by, and that is the N1 chip. Now, we are not talking about the main hardware processing unit here. We are not talking CPU, GPU, but we're talking about the networking chip. Because yes, all iPhone 17s including the iPhone Air, are powered by the N1. The N1 is Apple's first in-house designed Wi-Fi and Bluetooth modem, not to be confused with Apple's C1 and now C1X, which are their in-house designed 5G modems. And the N1 is powered by Wi-Fi 7, so that puts it in line with the last generation iPhones and puts it a little bit ahead of the Max and the iPad Pro, which are currently on Wi-Fi 6E, and it's powered by Bluetooth 6, which is supposedly which is for now only on the iPhone 17 series. So that previously had not come to any other product, and even the AirPods Pro 3, which had just launched, which its Bluetooth connectivity is kind of crucial, but it's still based on Bluetooth 5.3, as are the latest Apple Watches. Apple Watch Series 11, Apple Watch SE, Apple Watch Ultra. So the N1 here especially would be quite a big leap, because on the HomePod Mini it would represent an uplift from Wi-Fi 4, because it was using an Apple Watch chip with very outdated Wi-Fi technology, to Wi-Fi 7, and on the Apple TV it would be a jump skipping Wi-Fi 6E, so jumping from Wi-Fi 6 to Wi-Fi 7. Now, speaking of the Wi-Fi 7 in the N1 chip, Sashanak, I see you're from India. That's nice. A lot of my viewers afterwards, like not my live viewers, but like my VOD viewers, a lot of them are from India. So hello to India here. But yes, DN1 chip, Wi-Fi 7, Bluetooth 6, Thread connectivity. However, a lot of people now are talking about the fact that yes, it does not support the 320 megahertz standard that is part of the Wi-Fi 7 spec. It's a voluntary part of the Wi-Fi 7 spec. It's part of the 6 gigahertz network that is supported by Wi-Fi 6E and Wi-Fi 7. And the basic idea behind this, obviously, the more, in this case, the more megahertz bandwidth you have here, the more data you can put into it. That's a very, very basic statement. It obviously has other limitations, like if you have a bandwidth with higher megahertz frequency, then you unfortunately also reduce its range and its ability to penetrate obstacles like a wall. So while yes, it's most likely not reaching the highest possible speeds that you could be getting from such a modem, that was already the limitation of the iPhone 16 models. They had 160 megahertz Wi-Fi 7 rather than 320. It's most likely that the max speed is probably gonna come in around the same 2.4 gigabits per second, as is the maximum speed actually on across Apple's Wi-Fi 6E devices and Apple's Wi-Fi 7 devices. However, we also already have a precedent with the iPad, with the iPhone Air, that instead of the C1 chip that came to the iPhone 16e, instead it got the C1X modem, and Apple promised up to twice the speed of the C1 in the C1X after just 6 months. Now we do not yet know if they also promised even better efficiency. So I don't know if that means the C1X might be built on TSMC's 3 nanometer node, while the C1 we know was built on 4 nanometer. I believe it had a 7 nanometer transmitter and then a 5 nanometer class or 4 nanometer processor, basically, or the actual modem part. So we do not know that much about the C1X. We know even less about the N1, so we'll have to put it to the test. But the reason why I mentioned the C1X is because that, of course, leaves the door open for eventually an N1X or just a faster N2 down the road. Of course, an N1X, for example, might be optimized for iPads, right? Because maybe it would need larger antennas to work with, higher power behind it, more cooling, right? So plus maybe people using iPads and of course Macs, in Apple's eyes, benefit more from higher peak download speeds than iPhone users, whereas iPhone users just benefit from a lower power consumption. So maybe Apple doesn't see the point in doing 320 megahertz, at least for now, and at least for now on iPhone. But we'll have to see how this evolves. Beyond that, the Apple TV, for example, is being rumored to support Apple Intelligence. Now, the way it would do that, we are not sure. It's most likely getting the A17 Pro chip, but would it need the same 8 gigabytes of RAM to handle Apple Intelligence as Apple deems as the minimum? Would Apple potentially scale down some of its Apple Intelligence by maybe relying on like 6 gigabytes? Would Apple increase pricing to put an A17 inside there with 8 gigabytes? Would Apple rely more on the private cloud compute servers to handle some of its Apple Intelligence capabilities? We do not know. Even less we know about the HomePod Mini, which is also kind of rumored to be getting Apple Intelligence, but at this point we are definitely not talking about like on-device processing the way that the Apple TV is rumored to be getting it. And now we don't know, does it mean that the connected iPhone is supposed to be computing it? Is private cloud compute supposed to be computing it? We simply do not know. Next is M5 MacBook Pro. Now, this is more specifically mentioned in the Mark Gurman report as potentially coming in early 2026. Now, it should be noted that previously we have seen a lot of Macs come out in the fall based on Apple Silicon. Of course, with the most recent example being the M4, M4 Pro, and M4 Max MacBook Pros last year, but also the M4 Mac Mini and iMac. So there is a precedent in there, but we've heard rumors now by Mark Gurman and even some others that Apple might want to push them into early 2026 to keep the holiday season open for other products. To be honest, I do not think that would really work. Like what? Would you expect to sell a lot more M5 iPad Pros or M5 Vision Pros during the holiday season if they don't put out an M5 MacBook Pro at that point? Do they not want to hurt potentially the last opportunity to sell M4 Max before they jump to a new generation? I couldn't tell you. Apple has been quite happy with cannibalizing older generations with new generations. When it comes to Apple Silicon, a lot of older generations sell at outrageously low prices by Apple standards, just because M1 is still good enough. So people might still buy it at $550, $600. But when the M4 MacBook Air is just 1,000, and now with 16 gigabytes of RAM, well, then people will think twice about actually buying like a previous generation Mac. When the M5 MacBook Pro launches, also expect to get M5 Pro, M5 Max MacBook Pros. At least that has been the track record in recent times for the M4 generation, the M3 generation, launching those simultaneously. Hopefully that means some form of M5 Max, M5 Ultra, Mac Pro, and Mac Studio are not too far away. And these devices would actually connect to another thing that is rumored by Mark Gurman for early 2026, which is a new Mac display. Now, it is most likely a Studio Display successor and not a Pro Display XDR successor. However, we simply do not know, right? It could be somewhere in between. It could be like $3,000 and have capabilities that neither the Studio Display nor the Pro Display XDR have, like 120 hertz. It could have much denser mini LED display technology than the Pro Display XDR, but maybe it wouldn't have quite its advanced cooling solution and its ability to basically mimic the functionality of some prosumer creator monitors, right? So we simply do not know. Unfortunately, Mark Gurman has not been too concrete about it. We kind of guessed that it's going to be 27 inches. I would kind of hope Apple just gives it a 30-inch display, puts it right between the current 27-inch and the 32-inch Pro Display XDR, and kind of makes this the standard. There are also, of course, other display technologies that Apple could be using, like Tandem OLED, which they've introduced on the M4 iPad Pro, but I don't think that's very likely, at least to be honest. I have no idea. I've had the most massive sneeze attack before the before the stream. So I know I sound nasal, but I hope I don't sound obnoxiously nasal to you guys. Now, one device that makes a lot of sense to launch early 2026 is the M4 MacBook Air. That would line up with the launch of several previous MacBook Airs. So, and especially just from this year, the M4 MacBook Air, so just a full 1 year cycle, as we've now seen on a lot of Apple Silicon Macs. There's also a rumor about an A18 based cheaper MacBook, and supposedly that was coming late this year, but we do not yet know if this would be technically like a MacBook SE or E, or just a MacBook or a MacBook Air that's cheaper. So we'll have to keep an eye out on that. But that, of course, would give us quite a lot of M5 devices across MacBook Air, MacBook Pro. And that's why I'm not so sure if I believe the rumor that the M5 MacBook Pro's launch is going to be postponed from late this year to early 2026, because now it would mean that the MacBook Air kind of simultaneously competes with the MacBook Pro, and I don't know if that's the kind of like confusing marketing of launching both of those devices simultaneously that Apple actually wants. I think having 3 months or so for the MacBook Pro without any competition. In the meantime, the M4 MacBook Air is more than good enough for entry-level buyers. And then once the M5 MacBook Air comes out, that further pushes down the pricing of the M5 MacBook Pro. So people who decide to buy a little bit later can benefit from a lot more choice. Now they can choose from previous M4 generations, which have gotten further cheaper still. They can now choose between M5 MacBook Air and MacBook Pro, so plenty to think about. Now, when it comes to the M5 MacBook Pro, we know supposedly Apple is targeting a redesign with an OLED screen, but not for the M5 generation, but rather for the M6 generation. So if a lot of your purchasing decisions are based around waiting on this supposed redesign, don't expect that to come true, no matter if it comes late this year or early next year. Then he also references the iPhone 17e, just as a successor to the 16e. It would use the A19 chipset. Most likely it would also use the N1 modem. It might use an even newer generation of Apple's 5G modems, maybe SC2 or maybe some form of C1X like what the iPhone Air got. Most likely don't expect too many big camera changes because the iPhone 17 and 17 Pro didn't get the biggest camera changes, so I don't think Apple would want to make the E version suddenly super competitive against the other devices in that regard. But I would, for example, expect the new front-facing selfie camera with that square aspect ratio, higher resolution, allowing you to capture portrait or landscape photos and videos no matter how you hold it. So, and there's also been a rumor that the iPhone 17e would basically get the screen of the base iPhone 16. So that's still 6.1 inches, but that's now a screen featuring the dynamic island. It's also a screen that's substantially brighter than the iPhone 16e screen that maxes out at roughly 800 nits. In comparison, the iPhone 16 screen goes up to 2000 nits. Even if Apple limits that a little bit, maybe in software, just because of cooling reasons and battery life concerns, that would still open up a lot of room for improvements. Of course, if it's using the N1 modem, that potentially gives it room to jump from Wi-Fi 6 to Wi-Fi 7, even skipping Wi-Fi 6E, and of course up from Bluetooth 5.3 to Bluetooth 6, so that's quite a nice jump. Also, especially since Apple promises good efficiency on the N1, so hopefully that further helps with battery life. We don't know if there are any battery capacity increases rumored for the 16E. It already has pretty good capacity for a 6.1-inch iPhone. In fact, it had the highest battery, well, it still has the highest battery capacity for any 6.1-inch iPhone, but now when you look at the 17 Pro, that's a 6.3-inch iPhone, but it's not really physically that much larger because it has much thinner bezels, and that one now goes up to 4,200 milliampere hours. Well, this one gets close to 4,000. It's like 3,950 or something like that. I apologize, guys. I have no idea why my nose is so closed up. Hopefully, I'm not getting sick or anything. Smart Home Hub. Last but not least, Apple should finally debut its long-awaited Siri Hub within the first few months of 2026. This product was on track to launch last year, but it relied heavily on Apple Intelligence. Now, Apple Intelligence Siri, large language model Siri, is rumored for an early 2026 release alongside iOS 26.4, so roughly in March or April, somewhere around that. And this would be a good product to launch alongside it, maybe be introduced in an event that shows the iPhone 17e. So an opportunity for another event that would come a little bit later than what we had last year with the iPhone 16e, but then the iPhone 16e didn't have its own event. It was just updated in a newsroom announcement by Apple. But now that they have more hardware, and who knows, some of the other hardware we have mentioned might have to be delayed. Maybe Apple doesn't feel comfortable in launching a HomePod mini while the new Siri isn't ready, for the same reason why a smart home hub, which would also include HomePod functionality, is not launching until some point in 2026. Maybe AirTags need more time, who knows, right? Though of course the U2 chip seems ready, as we know by its inclusion version on the AirPods Pro 3. Just saying, there's always room for stuff to be delayed, some stuff to even be canceled. So always take some of these rumors and leaks with a pinch of salt. And speaking of leaks and rumors, this is actually now, I kind of memed about it on Twitter. We're kind of moving, of course, beyond the iPhone 17 rumors now that those are out. We're moving to iPhone 18 rumors, which are, of course, now a full year away. Now, we've already had previous leaks and rumors about the iPhone 18 family, and we've had leaks and rumors for the iPhone 17 that didn't turn out to be true, that are now basically being applied to the iPhone 18 series. Now, this is a leak from a Weibo leaker we actually covered quite a lot here, Insta Digital, and he's claiming the following. Apple's next generation iPhone 18, iPhone 18 Pro, and iPhone 18 Pro Max models. So previously, this rumor only applied to the Pros. In fact, for a while, this rumor only applied to the Pro Max, but it applied to the iPhone 17 Pro Max. So now this leak is being pushed a year further, and it's now being applied to more devices. And the leak says that these devices will be equipped with a slightly smaller dynamic island, but unlike previous rumors, including a long leaked timeline for Apple Display technology by Ross Young, is that they will not feature under-screen Face ID. So you would basically get like a thinner or less wide dynamic island, which to me kind of makes sense with the way dynamic island and like its widgets and everything kind of have become an integral part of the iOS user experience. If you're using an iPhone, I don't really see why Apple would be in any rush to add more expensive technology that potentially gets rid of it, right? I mean, sure, some might say, well, just reduce it to one camera cutout. And we've had leaks saying, oh, the iPhone 18 will actually have like a camera cutout on one side, like here or something like that. But that would be just very confusing. Suddenly you take away the symmetry, suddenly it becomes less clear where you're putting like dynamic island widgets and live activities. So just having a smaller dynamic island that's less intrusive while you're actually surfing the web or watching a YouTube video, I think that makes a lot of sense. There's also a big redesign rumored for the 20th anniversary, supposedly all glass iPhone, though honestly, I don't think that the device is actually going to be all glass. I think now that Apple simultaneously redesigned two parts of the iPhone family, of course, the new design of the iPhone Air, kind of being a derivative of previous base versions and previous Pro versions, with its non-focus on so many cameras, with its camera bump, with its use of titanium, and then, of course, the Pro models that are now being redesigned around an aluminum unibody. I don't think that Apple will be in a rush to add yet another new design. Don't forget, Apple is also having to work right now on foldable devices. So that would be quite a lot of new designs to handle in just 3 short years. While I do believe that an iPhone 20, quote unquote, if Apple keeps numbers, or iPhone 19, is going to get a redesign, I'm just not going to believe that it's all glass until I see more leaks and rumors. I could see like a slightly curved glass front, like what the Apple Watch has, which without curving the actual screen, but by like curving the bezels a little bit, it creates a little bit of this 3D effect, right? In fact, that's something that Xiaomi and other companies have done before, but now they're getting rid of it for less complexity and I guess for more uniformity with the iPhone design language. So we'll have to see how the dynamic island evolves, how Apple treats a device that does not have ID, does not have Face ID, like the upcoming foldable, because that one will have Touch ID. So again, we're still a year away. This is one Weibo source, but it does connect to some previous leaks and rumors, so I just wanted to mention that for now. Let me see if there are any other leaks and rumors that might have come out while I'm covering this. No. Also, small reminder, yes, tomorrow we are getting the official release of iOS 26 on September 15th. To the beta users, I've had some questions about that. People asking, do I think that the release candidate this year is going to be the same as the actual final release? I'm actually not sure. Last year we didn't have a ninth beta. This year we got one. I think iOS 26, iPadOS 26, but especially macOS 26 Tahoe, I think they need a little bit more work. I don't think that they are anywhere near broken or anything like some people try to imply, but I think having maybe 2 more extra weeks for the iPhone, so maybe 1 more beta at least, having a month more for the Mac, I would argue, I think that would make a lot of people much more confident in the release. For a lot of regular people, I'm probably going to be recommending that they wait for like iOS 26.1 before they actually install it. In the meantime, they'll be able to use iOS 18.7, so they'll still keep getting all the most relevant security updates and patches. And then once they think iOS 26 is ready, they can update to that. Now, I promised you benchmarks, and we do have benchmarks. Now, as you can also see in the chat where I've linked our Discord, and as I've shown you here, wait, we had several new people joining. Guys, join the stream if you're watching. Oh, Sashanak, you joined. That's so cool. I'm just gonna wave to all of you. Thank you, Sashanak here and EM. So thank you guys so much for that. I guess the Discord interested you more than me being live. I'm just gonna give you a nice spanking. No, thank you so much. So this is the Discord. We have a lot of stuff being posted there. I myself am also looking for new results. I've also actually done some really boring work and just went hunting for some old Geekbench GPU scores and stuff like that, some Geekbench AI scores, so feel free to check it out. Also, again, big thanks to Jimmy James, longtime supporter of the channel and everything like that, who is accumulating all data. Go there. We have real experts, like real Geekbench original devs who might help you with your questions. So yeah, if you're enjoying my stream, I promise you'll enjoy the Discord as well. However, speaking of stuff that's coming from the Discord, so first we have more results. This is coming from Jimmy. Thank you for the summary. For the iPhone 17 Pro Max, so you see the vast majority of results are coming at around 3,800. There are outliers that are completely irrelevant, like in the 2,200 range. This happens when the device just is completely thermally heat soaked. This might have actually been tested in efficiency mode. I cannot vouch for that, or the device was just doing something super hardcore in the background. But it seems like this is where you'll see the curve. That being said, I still think that 3,600, 3,700 are not actually that representative for a device that's well cooled, doesn't have anything going on in the background, and I think for the real world, a lot of the curve will actually happen around here. So you'll get something very easily in the high 3,800s or in the low 3,900s, and maybe if you slightly win the silicon lottery and your device is maybe pre-chilled, or you're a geeker van and you're connecting it to like a liquid nitrogen solution, you'll be getting 4,000. You see a nice uplift uplift year over year. You can also there are also people on Twitter like Raphael or Lafiel. I apologize if I mispronounce it. I've been trying to limit my Twitter usage, so that's why I'm less familiar with the usual Twitter people. But he does some analysis on like instructions per clock gains year over year. So if you're interested in that, go over there. I also comment on his Twitter stuff occasionally. So I'm still on Twitter, unfortunately. But this is where we see the iPhone results. And in fact, we even have like a distribution graph for different parts of the Geekbench 6.5 testing. And you can see how it compares relative to the 16 Pro Max, right? So we have mild improvement, sometimes from 5% to maybe sometimes even closer to 10%. Maybe some outliers might even show like a reduction. That's probably gonna come from some extremes being included, like some of the 20 to 200 points, right? This one is a graph that Jimmy created that does actually not remove any of the extremes. Usually you would remove like 2% of the extremes or something like that, just to make sure that some of the craziest data are not included, some of the data that's obviously wrong. And then of course I myself went hunting for some Geekbench stuff. Where's the rest of my Pixelmator? No, there it is. So do I have everything I wanted? So those are the AI scores. Now, more specifically, we're talking about the GPU AI scores here. And that's because this is where Apple promised the largest generational uplift on the iPhone 17 versus the iPhone 16, on the 17 Pro versus the 16 Pro, basically on the A19 generation versus the A18 generation. During the presentation, Apple talked about 3x uplifts. On some of the website, they even make claims about 4x uplifts. Now, these are AI scores from the GPU. So you can run AI tasks on the CPU, you can run it on the neural engine, and you can run it on the GPU. And Apple's specific claims this year focused around this portion, on the AI compute of the GPU, by saying it now has its own AI accelerators. Obviously, the neural engine, that's an AI accelerator all on its own. That's the most efficient part that handles AI tasks. The CPU by Apple has AI accelerators built onto it. They also help with tasks like scalable matrix extensions. So Apple has been building AI accelerators into CPU for quite a while as well. And for the first time, Apple is now building dedicated AI accelerators into the GPU compute pipeline. If we look at the last generation iPhone 16 Pro, you see results where there was actually very little difference between like 8 or 16-bit or 32-bit. Well, now Apple promised double compute 16-bit. This is why there is like no difference between these tests. But you see a massive uplift here of almost 2.7x. Now, I've seen some scores that aren't necessarily higher, but I've seen like the iPhone 16 Pro also perform lower than this, so maybe I just picked the highest one. It could just be like on average about 3 times faster. Maybe for certain tasks that are highly optimized, up to 4 times faster when the task is running on the GPU. Now, it should be noted that it's very unlikely that the task would be running only on the GPU. Do I really not have this open? Here. And that's because a lot of your AI tasks will actually run on the neural engine. And when you actually look at the neural engine, well, the neural engine this generation has not gotten a huge uplift. This is the neural engine performance on the iPhone 16 Pro Max. So also we have some quite the difference on the based on the precision level of the benchmark. And we see results that are almost 3 times faster than the fastest quantized scores now on the 17 Pro Max's GPU. And yes, we do have like roughly a 10% uplift over the 16 Pro Max generation. That uplift just makes a lot of sense given what we know about the higher clocks on the A19 chips in general. It makes sense what we expect from the N3P node, right? So 10% faster, probably at around the same power consumption level, maybe even better sustained AI performance from the A&E, because obviously the better cooling, for example, on the iPhone Pros. But yes, the A&E remains 2 times to almost 3 times faster than the AI acceleration on the GPU. So don't actually expect the overall compute amount to be 3 times faster. It should also be noted, and that's now very technical, and maybe go to our Discord to discuss this in more detail. And that is that it's actually really hard in Core ML, and basically the API that Apple gives developer to that Apple gives developers when it comes to accessing their AI hardware. It's actually really hard in that API to isolate a specific part of the SoC. So even though a Geekbench AI score might tell you this was running only on the CPU, or this was running only on the GPU, or this was running only on the neural engine, that is not necessarily true. Some of these tests might actually still put some of the AI compute on other components. Some of them might not even fully utilize the component that they're referencing. So while I'm not down talking the Geekbench developers, it's really more of a problem on Apple's side. We'll have to see how the actual real world combined CPU, combined GPU, combined neural engine AI performance is of the iPhone 17 Pro Max. So here's its A&E performance again. Sorry. Where did I put the other one? And here is its GPU performance on AI. So a lot faster than the 16 Pro Max that you see here. In fact, it's actually one of the largest. In fact, it's actually the largest generation uplift in quite some time. Actually, thank you to ChatGPT for taking all my screenshots here. Here are like results from the A12 Pro, like 8 times slower, you see, than what the A19 Pro achieves. Then a big uplift actually from the 12 Pro, from the A14 chip to the A15 chip. Then not so big gains from A15 to A16, decentish gains to the A17, because this is also where another node jump is happening. And now, of course, huge leaps on the 17 Pro generation versus the 16 Pro. But yes, if you're interested in all of that, data that I analyze or data that Jimmy analyzes, or even some high quality feedback from actual developers, go to our Discord, because I won't have to speak through my fucking closed off nose there. I might have actually more fun right now interacting with Discord. Yeah, so hope that helped you understand a little bit about the AI performance. We did cover, of course, the CPU results, now with the highest results pointing to like a 4,000 points in single core, 11,000 points in multi-core, so putting it actually higher than the first generation Snapdragon 8 Elite, which given how much more power the 8 Elite sucks than the A18 Pro, I was honestly surprised by that. I thought Apple would just target 10,000 points and be done with it. But hey, maybe the efficiency gains of the architecture, the new node, are actually significant enough to give them the freedom to do like 11,000 points, while maybe the Snapdragon 8 Elite Gen 5, that one just goes straight to 11,500. That's the results we have seen, maybe even an 11,500 and a 12,000 point results, maybe specifically on like actively cooled devices, but we'll have to see once Qualcomm actually officially presents that chip. And yes, last shout out, go to the Geekbench. More people there now, more discussion points, a lot of people with good data. Thank you so much. Now, I do have one thing that I would like to cover, and that's something we haven't done in a little while. I would like to react to another YouTuber to react to a controversial video. And this is Drew actually jumping back into Apple sheep mode to defend the iPhone Air. Now, I know some of you here in the community, like Riley, really dislike the iPhone Air. You dislike it only having one camera. You dislike it for having a way smaller battery. You dislike it for not having a vapor chamber like the Pro iPhones. Who knows, right? Who knows what the actual real-world repercussions of certain choices are? I personally dislike the iPhone Air mostly for having a single front speaker. Now, that front speaker looks bigger than it does on other devices, so maybe it's literally 2 times better, but who knows? Unfortunately, it really does not have a bottom speaker, so no matter how good that one front-facing speaker on the top is, I doubt it will be good enough to suddenly sound like a full stereo system. But we'll have to see. In this case, I won't be seeing it myself because I am not ordering an iPhone Air. I am dealing with just the iPhone Pro Max. But I might go into a store to briefly check out the speakers and obviously everything else about the iPhone Air. And of course, we'll watch reviews together. We'll watch camera comparisons together, side-by-side performance stuff, side-by-side speaker stuff. So hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell. That way you're actually informed when I'm going live next. Thank you for all of that. And without further ado, let's actually get started with Drew.
You know, when you do those same-day event recap videos, you don't have a lot of time to really dive into a new subject, and that's what I wanted to do for today's video, because I'm processing so many different opinions now that we've had a day to kind of digest and process everything Apple dropped on us, and the more I'm thinking of how they've laid out the whole iPhone 17 and iPhone Air lineup, the more sense it's actually starting to make. So no, you're not...
It should be noted that I actually agree with Drew that the lineup makes sense. But the reason why I think the lineup makes sense is because I think that the iPhone 17 base model with its 6.3 inches is kind of, not really, but kind of a replacement for both the base iPhone 16 and 16 Plus in many ways. Sure, will it give you quite the battery life of a Plus iPhone? No. But hey, it gives you now a brighter screen than any Plus model, a higher refresh rate screen than any Plus model before it, higher resolution ultra-wide camera, more performance. So sure, would an iPhone 17 Plus at $900 to me look like a way smarter choice than the iPhone Air is at $1,000? Yes, but I also think that Apple wouldn't really like that device too much. What if the device eats into the sales of the Pro models too much, right? What if the device doesn't actually sell that much at all because most people just buy the base model? And now the question is, well, we created this super high value device, but people still don't want it that much. People didn't want the Mini too much. They didn't want the Plus models. I believe they still regularly crack the top 10 best-selling smartphones in the world. But by Apple standards, they just really underperformed. So might as well just double down on the base model, give it better value than ever, give it more performance than ever, kind of make its gap to the Pro model smaller than ever. and see where the chips land and use the extra space that the removal of the Plus model opens up to make something new. In this case, the iPhone Air, and down the road we'll have even more devices in the iPhone lineup like the iPhone Fold, so might as well build the iPhone Air kind of as like a living prototype of the upcoming iPhone Fold, because I assume that an iPhone Fold will basically be two iPhone Airs connected with a hinge and through a foldable display.
Getting a rant on Apple today, you're getting a good old-fashioned Apple Sheep defense rant on the differentiation between why the 17 Pro is the way it is and why the iPhone Air is the way it is. Let's begin. I'm glad everyone can agree the base iPhone 17 is cool. There's just like no argument there. Even against equivalently priced Androids, it's kind of hard to argue. iPhone 17 regular is just solid across the board. It's just a great overall phone. There's very little to complain about, but there seems to be a lot of complaining going back and forth between the iPhone Air and the iPhone 17 Pro. Why did Apple...
I don't think so. I don't think any... Like people on Twitter will have this discussion, because they will claim like, oh, I'm an Apple enthusiast, so I want the fastest and longest battery from Apple, but I also want the prettiest from Apple. And they will like ask the question, well, why couldn't Apple put that into like one product, right? In my opinion, I'll honestly, like, my hot take is, I think the iPhone Air is drop dead gorgeous. I really think it's probably the most beautiful smartphone you could design nowadays. However, I have to say, for my own personal stuff, I prefer the design of the 17 Air, because design, like literally what Apple put in the video with the Steve Jobs quote, it's not just about how something looks, it's also about how something feels and works. And in this case, I actually do believe that aluminum will be very nice to hold here, right? I also think the fact that this device will run less hot most of the time will be a nice differentiator in actual user experience. Yeah, I'm not even talking about like, oh, it's actually higher performance and it has more cameras. I don't count that as design, but how hot a device runs, to be honest, to me, that's part of design. That's part of just like basic engineering, even though, of course, the engineering in here, in neither device, to be honest, is not basic. So, see it as you want. I love the blue color here. I think it's the best color ever on any iPhone. And this is not recency bias. The reason why I think that is because this color is aluminum. It's anodized aluminum. And I think that anodized metal just has this combination of premium look and feel to me, and knowing that it's actually pretty protected. So while I do have now two cases for this device, I do have my blue tech woven case from Apple, but I've also now ordered from Amazon a clear case, one of those clear cases that has like a stand that's like a little metal part around the camera ring, and I actually have pre-ordered Jesus Christ, I forget which company it was. It wasn't Taurus. Jesus, which company did I order it from? But like they make like protective glass that's not self-made. It's actually Corning glass. That's why it's so much more expensive than their other glass. And it's also their most anti-reflective protective glass. So one thing I didn't want was to get the new ceramic shield technologies, but then cover it all up with a hyper-reflective screen, basically losing all the benefits in the process. The only thing that I dislike about the color of the iPhone 17 Pro Deep Blue is the color of the glass. While I don't think it's actually a bad color, I just think it's worse than the color of the aluminum.
people do it this way, and I'll even confess, yeah, the clear cases are weird. I don't know why they did that, and it's bizarre that there's no black 17 Pro. I don't understand that either. It feels almost like they're deliberately trying to get more people to consider the Air by still offering that color over there, but what I think this is actually Apple diversifying the iPhone lineup to more accurately represent the buying public. It's actually quite genius now that I've had some time to think about it, which of course Apple is very good at letting us know what we want before we know we want it. That's why I'm an Apple sheep at the end of the day, right? For the longest time, for the past year, this...
Which is interesting, right? Because he promised more non-Apple content on his channel, which is fine, right? But that's because he claimed he was less enthused about Apple. I think he has way less of an excuse to claim that this year. Even Mark Gurman talked about how Apple is focusing more on their design prowess this year. Honestly, I disagree that they're focusing on it this year. Don't forget that designing something like the titanium iPhones was not easy either, right? But I do agree that it's part of just like a PR push. When Apple has always been internally design focused, always been proud of their design work. But I do believe that Apple is now more aggressively pushing PR for that strength, because some stuff like Apple Intelligence has not wowed the masses, to say the least. There have been some bad narratives about other Apple choices in terms of marketing, specifically even around Apple Intelligence, like making ads for features that didn't yet exist and weren't gonna come out in the next 2 or 3 months even. And I think that Apple has done a lot in recent years to actually change as a company to the better in a lot of nerdy ways. They're way more positive now on do-it-yourself repairs, not just in terms of giving you parts and tools, but also making devices internally easier to repair, easier to deconstruct and put back together, I guess one could say. Apple has become now more positive on cooling, with the iPhone's vapor chamber. I hope that's something that propagates and moves up to the iPad Pro, the MacBook Pro. Would make sense a lot in the MacBook Air if you think about it, right? It has a big aluminum chassis. It would make sense to have some of the heat dissipated away from the chip and down to an area that might be less actually hot to you, right? So while you type on the keyboard and of course you touch the trackpad, maybe you could dissipate a lot of that heat to the sides. That would result in quite a large and therefore expensive vapor chamber. A fan would be cheaper, to say the least. But if Apple does a lot of vapor chambers going forward, right, just absolute crazy mass orders for that technology, I first gives it to the Pro devices, especially the passively cooled ones like iPhone and iPad. But I think the MacBook Pro could also use a vapor chamber. Next year, for example, the MacBook Pro is, or maybe early 2027, the MacBook Pro is supposed to be getting a redesign to be made thinner. Vapor chambers could be a huge part in making it thinner without reducing its cooling capacity. So you could still have very high-powered Pro and Max chips in the 14 and 16-inch version that still function just like you would expect. So Apple has changed a lot. They have been more positive on RAM, doubling it on the M4 generation. They've now been more positive on storage, doubling it on the base iPhone 17. Sure, are they still far removed from the generosity of certain Chinese brands that give you 8.4 gigabits per second SSD speeds on the Vivo X300 by having double 4-lane UFS 4.1 storage and shit like that. No, but that's never been Apple's forte. Apple does build a lot of high-end and even class-leading hardware and even revolutionary hardware. Just look no further than like the tandem OLED screen on the iPad Pro or the single core performance of any Apple series Apple chip, A series or M series, or the efficiency of Apple's e-cores on the iPhone and iPad, or how Apple's in-house designs benefit chips like the H2 in handling transparency and active noise cancellation while still giving you a good amount of battery life. But Apple is never really that much about raw numbers. The fact that the M4 and now the A18, the A19 Pro hit like 4,000 points in Geekbench, that's not because Apple was gunning for that number. I apologize. It's my nose. It's because I cannot breathe through my nose. I have to breathe a lot more through my mouth. But Apple was not gunning to get you like 4,000 points in Geekbench. What Apple was targeting was a very responsive, nice device. And the way they achieve it, does it have to have a certain exact amount of storage speed? No. Does it have to have a certain amount of RAM or RAM speed? No. Does it have to have exactly 4,000 points in Geekbench? No. But we can hit that, and then we can combine it with good, but still somewhat price-efficient hardware on storage and memory, and we can make a very attractive package, highly optimize it for our operating system, and kind of be done with it. Well, if you're a brand that's always about chasing specs just for a raw number on the sheet, don't get me wrong, I'm excited for that too. I'm a sucker to know about the latest PCIe 5.0 storage hitting like 14,000 megabits per second. I'm excited for that. I'm excited about Android devices utilizing 10,667 megatransfers per second memory. Absolutely, that's very exciting. But my question to it is always, what's the end result? And unless you're putting that then combined with something like the active cooling system of the Red Magic, very often you're just actually making the device consume more power just to reach those numbers. And then you have to give it more cooling. Then you make the device thicker and heavier, or you make the device just more expensive than people would otherwise expect from a brand. And then you put all those resources potentially into all that crazy hardware, only to combine it with a not so optimized Android skin that's basically a one-to-one copy of iOS. And suddenly the fact that it might have like 5 times faster storage than the iPhone means very little to the end consumer. Just saying, this is a little bit ranty, and I will talk about devices like the Vivo X300 and Pro and Ultra and everything like that, and of course the upcoming Samsungs. I'm just trying to tell you, this number chasing, it's really not always even sustainable. Look at Samsung, right? Samsung is now doing arguably better than ever because they stopped chasing numbers. Instead, they really focused on like a pretty efficient Android skin, on having unique features on One UI, on having a good ecosystem of watches and earbuds and even tablets, and that helps them a lot. Maybe not like in a market like China. Oh my God, why did I say China like Trump says it? China. I'm so sorry. But they are doing really good. Relatively high profit margins from their smartphone sector. Pretty good sales that are increased from generation to generation, even if the specs don't change so much. They are getting more and more backlash these days, and I am kind of forgetting what original point I was making. Maybe I am actually a little bit sick. But yeah, like Apple is not about numbers chasing, and the iPhone Air is kind of a statement in that regard, where it is chasing actually one number, and that's specifically the number that how thin it is. But in every other aspect, it's just designed to be pretty.
Was rumored. A lot of the leaks ended up being correct, but as usual, we don't completely get the implementation and the software execution as well. And there are certain years where Apple disappoints us. I kind of feel like last year, especially with the overemphasis on Apple Intelligence, there was
Which again is marketing. Maybe you can try to blame it on Apple, but you still got really good devices. The 16 Pros had better cooling than the 15 Pros. They had larger batteries than the 15 Pros. They had a 48 megapixel ultra wide. The A18 was still your solid gen on gen improvement. I was not disappointing by the 16. Not I wasn't wowed by it enough to do like a year-to-year upgrades, but I haven't done year-to-year upgrades since the iPhone 7, ever since I upgraded from the 6S Plus to the 7 Plus.
A lot of disappointment, but I'm grateful this year was a lot more focused on just making solid, awesome hardware. And I think what Apple started wisely realizing is that the kind of buyer that is buying an iPhone, specifically because it is shiny, it is pretty, it is cool, and maybe even, yes, buying it for the status symbol, is not the same buyer that's buying an iPhone for work, for utility, for intensive graphic performance, networking performance.
Yes, but I would argue that there is still a balance that one needs in terms of battery life, and maybe not raw performance, maybe not even features like ProMotion, even though ironically every single one of these iPhones actually has perfect ProMotion, like 1 to 120 hertz, full LTPO support, a new display controller up to 3000 nits due to its high efficiency and everything like that. I would argue that the mix of features that regular people want is actually a little bit weird to the actual enthusiast. Like an enthusiast might say, "Oh, I'm happy with 2000 nits, right? As long as I have ProMotion." A less enthusiast person might say, actually, well, give me 3000 nits, especially if you want me to upgrade. And yeah, maybe I don't care about 120 hertz. iPhones always felt smooth to me, right? But they can see that brightness difference when they use it outdoors. But if they were never really that able to see the difference between 60 and 120 hertz, they might not care, right? With cameras, it really depends on what kind of photos they usually shoot. I would argue the ultra-wide camera is probably not that necessary for most people. But like a telephoto, for example, for somebody who has kids and is like constantly taking photos or videos of like school concerts and school sporting events, well, suddenly that telephoto camera might become 50, 60, 70% of your actual camera usage. And it might be like 80 or 90% of your emotional smartphone camera usage, right? Maybe in terms of utility photos, your main camera is still king, but when it comes to your important events, you just want to capture something that you really, really want to have afterwards. That might now be your 5 or 4x telephoto doing the work. So there are weird mixes. And for example, stuff like the better cooling on the iPhone Pro. You can argue, will a regular user ask for a vapor chamber? No, they're probably fine with the cooling on the base model. But will they be fine even as like a design enthusiast in having this device be substantially hotter, right? Because it has a faster chip, even though it is slightly more efficient because it has more cache. But it's way thinner than this. It has no vapor chamber like this, and it's titanium rather than aluminum on the sides, and rather than aluminum all around.
or video recording performance. These are actually two very different categories that in the past, because Apple liked to keep the iPhone lineup somewhat simple, they would just have the cheaper one and the more expensive one. And Apple was essentially bundling in all of those pro techie features into also the more beautiful, luxurious looking iPhone just to keep things simple between, all right, this one's cheaper, this one's more expensive one looks prettier and can do more. But
when was that ever the case? Like, I understand that people like the iPhone 10, for example. Sure, that one was prettier and more expensive, but then that one was also like newer, right? And it had like slimmer bezels because it was OLED, and it had a better screen because it was OLED. But then I would argue once you go to the iPhone 12 generation, which is the modern era of iPhone design, well, the most recent modern era, right? The 5G squared of iPhones. Are you really getting a much prettier device on the 12 Pro than on the base 12? Maybe if you prefer the shininess of the stainless steel versus the aluminum, but your lighter and arguably more comfortable device to hold, that was still your base iPhone 12. And the 12 mini was arguably the cutest one out of them all. And then, of course, that continued with the 13 mini. And then you got the Plus, which, again, was a much lighter, much nicer to hold version in many ways than the Pro Max versions of the day. So I don't think this applies as much just because Pro iPhones used a more premium material than the base model. I think that the Pro iPhones still use more premium materials than the base model. But while it may use aluminum, it now utilizes unibody aluminum. And it utilizes a glass that's like embedded in the aluminum. And it has a vapor chamber, which is also premium materials like copper and everything. So while you might not see every part of its design, the premiumness is still there.
Hard part of continuing that simple approach to the iPhone lineup is that there are many design decisions that are not exclusively good for work and good for the aesthetics of the overall phone, which are two very different buyers again. And now what I think we're seeing is Apple actually...
I don't think they're as extremely different as one might think. I think that, for example, the need for more battery life, I think that's universal enough for people to not consider the Air, especially once people find out that the screen of the Air is not even that much bigger than it is on the base model, right? 6.5 inches versus 6.3 inches, a way smaller difference than the Plus had versus the base model, and that didn't help the Plus too much. The Plus was 6.7, the base model was 6.1, now the Air is 6.5 versus the base is 6.3. Plus battery life, the Plus had way better battery than the base model, but the base model was adequate, and the people who really needed more battery, they could also then comfortably jump to the Pro models. Well, now the base model has better battery life than any base model before. In some ways, it actually competes with the previous Plus models for tasks like video playback because of its very efficient variable refresh rate LTPO panel. But now the Air has worse battery than the base model for more money. And I don't think that even a lot of enthusiasts will accept that, like design enthusiasts will accept that compromise.
Able to separate those two so that you can prioritize the better aesthetics on one model, like the iPhone Air, and the better utility on the other, like the iPhone 17 Pro and Pro Max. The reason I wanted to call this a defense rant is between the chat on my live stream, people complaining online across Reddit and Twitter and in YouTube comments. I saw a lot of hate towards the 17 Pros, which sure, some of it I can understand, but the overall consensus I think I disagree with, which is that, well, this is a bad phone because it's ugly, and they moved away from titanium, and that's bad. You've got this big seam across the glass where the metal meets the aluminum, and the phones look thicker, and the camera bump has never been bigger in iPhone history. So a lot of people were just like criticizing it for, hey, this phone is not as pretty or aesthetically as pleasing as the previous generation Pro iPhones. And while a lot of that may be true, I think the point that Apple is getting at is that's okay. This is an industrial focus trying to make an iPhone more built around the utility, where so many techies have been asking for this for years, as in make the phone as thick as possible, just give me more battery life.
Again, we're also talking devices. Yes, this camera bump probably makes it the thickest iPhone ever. I'm not disputing that. But the chassis, the vast majority of the chassis, where you will actually hold the device, at 8.725 millimeters, that one is actually still thinner than the iPhone 4. Now, granted, the iPhone 4 probably actually fits inside here. So I'm not going to say this device is going to compete with one-handed usability with an iPhone 4, but it's really not as industrial as, for example, something, or as brutalist as something like the Apple Watch Ultra. Again, I'm not actually attacking Drew's defense video. I actually think that in this video he makes some great points in favor of the iPhone Air. I just really think that all the points, and he doesn't dispute them, but I know he doesn't fully believe them. But some of the points that the broader community has been making about the iPhone Pros now being ugly, or being less premium than the Air because aluminum is less premium than titanium, these arguments are stupid. I never cared about which metal was in there as long as the metal did its job, which is structural integrity, feeling more premium than plastic, and still allowing for good cooling, good radio frequency transparency. So if the iPhone Air needs titanium for structural rigidity and the iPhone Pro needs aluminum for cooling and radio frequency, because similar to the Apple Watch Ultra, it has its antenna system right around that camera, which actually hides it pretty well in most angles. I think that's a pretty cool way to still make all of this metal. One thing that I wanted to mention, by the way, and that is in regards to cooling. It's not just the choice of materials, right? But think about if you have a case on top of your device. So previously, a case would only have an open spot around here, right? Now, okay, you still have like the glass and then the titanium expelling the heat through what is most likely a plastic or leather case. Okay, not the best thing, but adequate in most scenarios. Now, a case would have a much larger surface area that is open. You still now have the rest of the chassis that dissipates heat through the case, and that chassis is now aluminum. But look at the non-case covered part. Not only is it twice the size, right? But instead of being all glass, it's now basically all metal. And it's all metal that's very heat conductive, like aluminum, and it's metal that's connected to the rest of the aluminum chassis. I assume the plastic hopefully doesn't kill too much, like for the antenna lines, doesn't heat too much of the heat transfer. But the amount of extra heat that will be able to dissipate it through aluminum, through a vapor chamber that's roughly here, and especially through this plateau, and this is why I always try to tell people, when people say, well, why didn't Apple redesign the camera island before, right? And some people will say, well, the camera island still looks too similar for my taste. This camera island, well, not only is actually the telephoto camera like here absolutely huge, but because the plateau is pretty thick, because that's 8.725, with this it's 13 millimeters, that one actually can house several layers of components. And now this plateau even cools the device. And because it has so much more space, a lot of components that previously would have to be more over here or here, were able to be pushed up there. Combine that with a new antenna system. Yes, this is actually a proper redesign. This is not just taking a camera and moving it 5 millimeters lower to change the angle just so you could say, oh, it's a brand new design. This is actually a redesign. It's an external redesign in terms of materials being used, in overall aesthetic, especially with the two-tone, especially with the plateau. And yes, the fact that Apple kept the triangular camera arrangement should really speak volumes of the fact that Apple actually likes this, not just from an aesthetic perspective, but really from a usability perspective. or just from how they internally design the motherboard. So before you tell Apple to redesign this plateau again in a year or 2 years, believe me, it's only going to happen if Apple actually finds good reasons, engineering wise, to do so. They will not do so just to randomly change the camera arrangement.
Okay, that's kind of what they're doing here. And a lot of people are buying their iPhone, probably covering them up with all kinds of ugly cases. So they're not going to care what the iPhone looks like at the end of the day. They just want it to function really, really well. And that's where the vapor chamber comes in. And that's where the switch to aluminum comes in, which if you've watched my channel for a while, you know I've been pretty consistent on this. From the beginning, I've always said aluminum is the better material for a smartphone, not just from an aesthetic standpoint of the matte finish that's less
I agree, but it's aluminum if you do it as a unibody. If you do it on the sides, it does contribute to better cooling, but because glass is such a bigger portion of your chassis now, its impact is relatively small, so you might as well try to use maybe thinner titanium for even better structural rigidity. And arguably, you could even still reduce weight, even though titanium is a volumetrically heavier device than aluminum. So if you have the same cubic centimeter amount of titanium, it will be heavier than the same amount of volumetric aluminum. Well, but you can use way less titanium because it's such a much more rigid material. And maybe that choice wouldn't help you with radio frequency transparency and other things, even though it will still be worse for things like cooling. So yes, it really depends from device to device. Like if Apple tomorrow switched from aluminum to titanium on the iPad Pros, it will make those devices way more structurally rigid, but it would result in absolutely horrible cooling on that iPad unless Apple, I don't know, gives it a fan or puts in like a 10 times larger vapor chamber than they've just packed into the iPhone.
Printy. It's also much, much easier to do vibrant colors. That's part of the reason I'm so thankful and excited that they're actually doing cosmic orange. Usually the Pros don't get very vibrant, saturated colors. The only reason they can do that is because it's aluminum. They couldn't do that with steel. They couldn't do that with titanium. So if you wanted the more flashy, or I guess more shiny, polished chassis, well, now the iPhone Air can focus more on being...
And this is one thing that they've said about the Pixel. I think that polished chassis, I don't think they actually look always as good as some people make them out to be. But there is something away that Apple does polished. And it isn't actually just about stainless steel. If you remember the polished edges on Apple's aluminum devices, like the iPhone 5 and 5S, or if you remember, like it's not the entire side, right? It's just like that edge right at the front and the back, or how it was on previous iPads before Apple went flat. I actually think that Apple does polished in a way that quite nobody else does, at least in the smartphone space. Obviously, I understand if you're going into like a more beauty-focused industry, then yeah, Apple would have a lot more competition.
The aesthetically pleasing model that sure takes some feature cutting in order to achieve that aesthetic, but I think there's a ton of people out there that are already pretty excited to try it out, pick it up for the first time, and it gets a lot of people talking, which I'm actually quite grateful for, despite the iPhone Air's shortcomings. Yes, it sucks that it...
This color is so beautiful, and I think this is the best gold ever. I actually don't like the black too much, which is surprising to me. I think you kind of need a more like ethereal color on the iPhone Air to make it stand out. I think these three colors, I think also like a pink would work really well as a choice for like this. But yeah, these three colors are great, and obviously these two are more colorful than just white.
Doesn't have dual speakers anymore. Yes, there's a big concern around the battery life, even though on paper it sounds really good. Apple brought back the MagSafe battery pack just for the iPhone Air, which is not a great look. So as efficient as it may be, I think a lot of people have some concern when it comes to the overheating potential, which I hope is not that bad. But I think it's worth mentioning that there's a lot of people out there that are not buying the iPhone so that they can have the most state-of-the-art camera system on the back, where they need an 8x optical zoom, and a 48 megapixel ultra wide. No, honestly, a lot of people are buying their iPhone and using it for texting, FaceTime, taking a couple pictures. But honestly, a lot of influencers and younger people are using the front facing camera arguably more than the rear, which still got a big upgrade with the iPhone Air. With the center stage capability, that might actually be the sleeper feature across the entire lineup.
I agree. I think especially for content creators, especially, I think for like TikTokers, this will be amazing. I also wonder if Apple would allow a fully squared photo to be taken. But then the question is, would it be too wide, right? For that, so for a lot of stuff. But hey, maybe you could just bring it closer to your face at that point.
It's up winning a lot of people over to iPhone this year. So essentially what I'm trying to say is the existence of the iPhone Air, while it may not be perfect, it actually allows Apple to pursue a more industrial and functional approach with the iPhone 17 Pro's adopting aluminum, the far better material for thermal management, which is more likely to come up when you're a true pro user.
I also wonder what the cost of just the raw materials is, plus the energy to utilize them. Like, because you still have to use some ceramic shield on there, right? So it's not like you can entirely remove it from like the ceramic shield pipeline. And I mean, like, obviously the front has its own solution, the back has another solution. So I just really wonder, like, is this bigger amount of aluminum still cheaper than titanium? And is it bigger than titanium plus a larger piece of glass?
I think people should zoom out a little bit and just kind of look at iPhone Pro versus iPhone Air the same way we look at MacBooks. You know, the MacBook Pro is definitely not as thin or as light as the MacBook Air, but
but it actually has thinner bezels. It actually does have some aesthetic W's over the Air. I've argued with Riley about like space black being like a selling point that Apple makes exclusive to the Pros to make you upgrade from like a potentially an Air. But in my opinion, the Air actually has by far the more beautiful color in the lineup, which... And I don't just mean the sky blue. The sky blue is great, but I mean even for people who like more serious colors, the MacBook Air has one of my favorite aluminum colors by Apple. And in fact, it's really only the iPhone 17 Pro Max now that has surpassed it. Where is it? And that is midnight. Oh my God, that's so stupid. Come on, Apple, show me midnight. Show me midnight somewhere here. Give me a color choice. There it is. Midnight is really great, but deep blue on the iPhone 17 Pro is even better still, in my opinion. The deep blue is basically perfect. It's like my favorite shade of blue. I really hope it never goes away from the lineup, because that would probably be the color I choose basically every year or every time I buy a new Pro iPhone.
MacBook Air is still incredibly popular because not everybody buying a MacBook needs the legacy ports. Not all of them need the best possible speakers or the longest possible battery life.
True.
A lot of people want their laptop to just be thin and lightweight and reliable.
And don't forget, the base iPhone and the Air give you ProMotion screens with super slim bezels and really high in the same pixel density even as the Pro iPhones. The MacBook Air has a smaller screen. It has across both choices, right? It has 13 inches versus 14 inches. It has 15 inches versus 16 inches. It has thicker bezels to go with it. It does not have even decent HDR by like Apple's Pro standards. It doesn't have ProMotion or even any form of high refresh rate. It doesn't have high brightness in in outdoor usage. It doesn't have an anti-reflective solution. It has a little bit, but just nothing close to the nano texture or something like that. And people still choose the MacBook Air. Meanwhile, the iPhone Air and the base iPhone 17 are way closer to actually their Pro counterparts when it comes to the screen.
that has made the MacBook Air an extremely successful product despite not packing in the most amount of features. And Apple probably has better data on this than everybody. I think there's a decent chance a lot of the everyday consumers out there are not actually using the ultra-wide lens or the dedicated telephoto lens as frequently as the tech community thinks.
But even then, the telephoto lens, that one is now an argument for the pros. And I don't think Apple actually is afraid of the pros cannibalizing the Air. Because at that point, Apple's like, oh, you want to buy the more expensive product? One that in some ways might be like not cheaper to make, but at the very least will have a similar to even maybe higher profit margin. Yeah, we are fine with that. Would Apple be fine with the base model instantly like killing the Air? I'm not sure. The way they priced it kind of suggests they either believe the Air is way more powerful as a device, like in terms of like market penetration, or they simply didn't care and they thought, oh, we are producing so many base models, we might as well price it in a way that's actually like potentially destructive to the Air. That's more important. It's more important for us to sell potentially 2 base models just because of its reach than 1 extra Air model, right? And oh, if some people who liked the Plus before it are now forced to buy a last generation Pro Max or last generation Plus, or they collect a little bit more money and actually buy a current generation Pro Max, well, we aren't going to complain either, right?
People just say, don't buy the iPhone Air simply because it's lacking features that you can find on the not too much more expensive iPhone Pro. But again, come back to the MacBook debate. Yes, the MacBook Air is missing a lot of features compared to the Pro, but for a huge chunk of MacBook buyers, those don't matter all that much. A lot of people just want it to be thin, lightweight, and now that Apple can focus more on the iPhone Air being the pretty one, the engineering marvel, that means the Pro doesn't have to worry too much about being the pretty one or about having to be the most...
And yet it still is a very pretty one. Maybe not the pretty one in the lineup, but still a very pretty one.
Aesthetically pleasing. So essentially I'm trying to say, yes, the iPhone 17 Pros by some people's definition might look more ugly, and that's okay. It's all right to look more ugly. Sometimes, you know, the work truck that the farmers use is not going to be as pretty as the sports car, and you can argue that the work truck is more functional, it's got a big bed, it can sit more people, but that doesn't mean that the sports car that's lower to the ground, doesn't have as many seats, doesn't have as much cargo capacity is necessarily a bad purchase. It just comes down to what you're looking for in an iPhone purchase. So I feel like the name kind of gives it away, but it's still just not abundantly clear to everybody, because I think a lot of us have the older mindset that Pro is just supposed to mean the best of the best. Pro is supposed to be the prettiest, and Pro is supposed to be the most aesthetically pleasing.
I agree that this mindset is out there. I just never had that mindset because I guess I just know too much about Apple. Like, I remember just how compromised that original, like, manila envelope iPhone MacBook Air was, right? And it was actually more expensive than the MacBook Pro because the SSD storage at that time, well, it was expensive, but Apple wanted even higher margins based on that storage than they do nowadays, and versus the MacBook Pro at that point still using hard drives. So, yeah, I do still understand what the Air moniker means inside the Apple lineup.
Have all the features, when in reality, I think the comparison could be much better made between like a Mac Pro versus an iMac, if we're going to use more Steve Jobs era comparisons. The iMac does not do as much as the Mac Pro. It's not as fast, it's not as capable, doesn't have as many...
Depends a little bit on the time that you look at the iMac versus the Mac Pro. Arguably, if you look, of course, versus the iMac Pro versus the trash can Mac Pro, then it does a lot more. But that's because it also had much newer technologies.
Ports, came for a lot of everyday consumers out there, the iMac was perfect. It was an all-in-one approach. It did everything a lot of people needed and nothing they didn't. And I do think, especially with the adoption of the ProMotion display across the entire lineup, this year is going to be really interesting to see what amount of people are actually buying the Pro iPhones because they need the cameras. Really, the only advantage the Pros now have in regards to displays is that larger 6.9-inch variant, but that is a very big, heavy phone. Aside from that, you can now get a very bright, always-on, and high refresh rate display across the entire lineup. So essentially, yeah, the Pros are pretty much just coming down to, do you need a really good camera, do you need a massive display, and do you need the best battery life possible? If those three things are not super important to you, then
could argue you get another boost from the A19 Pro, but then again, you could also argue that 6 cores on the Pro Max relative to the screen resolution are actually probably comparable to 5 cores on the base A19, but then you still have a bit more performance in general. You have all the software features that are connected to Pro Raw, ProRes, now ProRes Raw even, but those are now niche features inside the niche, inside the niche. I don't think that Apple builds those devices actually. It's like, oh, you get ProRes RAW, pay us $200 more. I think if you do want an iPhone with a better camera, you were gonna pay $200 more, whether it had ProRes RAW exclusively or not. You probably would just be paying for the larger sensors, the better optical solutions and everything like that, even just the higher storage tiers versus the base model, even if the base model also had ProRes RAW.
Pro iPhones are pretty competitive, especially the iPhone 17 for the price, but there's a lot of techies out there that don't necessarily take a ton of photos with the rear camera. They just want a thin, lightweight, seemingly impossible thinness, and while I'm not even trying to argue that makes more sense for me or you, a lot of you guys that are techies that watch YouTube videos about the new iPhones that come out, that already puts you in a category that is more likely to care about features rather than just pure design
I agree.
aesthetic. Most of you are probably going to be pre-ordering the Pros because they have
you
the
guys saw, by the way, I'm using this video more as a bouncing off point to make my own statements rather than disagreeing with Drew. I actually think this is a pretty good video. I do think this video a little bit should be more critical towards specific iPhone Air choices, because I think there are specific points that will impact the design aesthetic fan, right? Like, I don't think that a fan who cares primarily about design really would be too accepting of not having like bottom speakers. Again, I do not know if this speaker is potentially way better than anticipated, right? I mean, look, it looks 2 times as wide as the front speaker does on my iPhone 15 Pro. So who knows what's going on over there, right? But just saying, removing like real stereo is not good at $1,000, no matter how your device is designed.
Better battery, the better cameras, and the bigger overall display.
And I think if this device was $899 versus just the full $999, I think it would have more of a place in the lineup. But who knows? Maybe it will just be the iPhone that loses its goes down from its MSRP the fastest, and then it might be worth its suggested price in 6 months or so.
But in regards to the mass market appeal, there's probably a lot of people who don't care all that much about that. And I know it sounds expensive because it's $1,000, but hey, look, the iPhone 10 was a big moment in history, mostly around the aesthetics, and that was back in 2017 for $1,000. There's been a lot of inflation since then. There's all kinds of trade-in deals. People are spending more on their iPhones, which means they can recoup more of that cost back when they up.
Also, similar to the iPhone 10, it is a launching point, right? It will get better. We already have rumors that like the 3rd generation iPhone Air is likely gonna come with a larger, like 6.7-inch screen. So that alone will make it taller and wider, because I don't think that the bezels are getting that much thinner that soon. So that would give us space for more battery. That will give us more space for like a bottom speaker. And Apple could do more radical decisions in it down the line, like removing the charging port and just saying, oh, this is our thinnest, lightest iPhone ever, at least relative to its size. We just thought wireless charging was good enough. We even paired a vapor chamber now with the charging solution. Now you get 25 to 30 watts of wireless charging. Why need this the port? It has like the N3 Wi-Fi 7 modem, actually with 320 megahertz. So look, your AirDrop is now at 4.8 gigabits per second. That's like 24 times faster than your USB 2 wired connection than it was before. Even if your wireless connection is less stable, it's so much faster. You could literally try it out 20 times and fail 19 times before you have the speed of the wired port. So. And they could even they could do a very small bottom speaker. Like look at this design here, for example. Like they could, instead of like a big bottom speaker, they could just relatively mirror this speaker like right here, right? Like as part of the bezel. Maybe it wouldn't even be as powerful as this one because this one connects to a somewhat thickerish speaker inside the plateau on the back. But yeah, I would argue there's a pretty good chance that Apple could do this, especially if they make this device ever so slightly thicker, which does happen sometimes. Or if they just use a new battery technology like silicon carbon, or if they somehow use tandem OLED on this device, which could be even thin, or it could be either an even thinner display, or it could be as thin but give you the same brightness and everything at lower power consumption. So suddenly you could actually, together with silicon carbon, put in a physically smaller battery that still has the same capacity but longer battery life because now your display is more efficient, or it actually has a slightly larger capacity because silicon carbon is so much more power dense. And now you have space for a small speaker in the front. You have potentially have space for like a second camera. Doesn't have to be anything crazy, just like a 48 megapixel ultra wide. And suddenly it looks a lot like a very thin, very light, and very premium plus model. And I think that makes sense. Like at $999, when you look at the iPhone 10 and you look at the subsequent revolution of things that have happened to it at the same $999 pricing, I think there's a lot of room that Apple keeps it for itself open in subsequent Air generations. I also think, just as I said before, if the Fold is literally 2 times an iPhone Air, at least in most ways, then I think the Fold could be $2,000, while this is $999, and suddenly it looks cheaper as part of the overall family. And boom, now it looks like a better value.
Because it's $1,000 upgrade, so $1,000 2025 is not the same as $1,000 in 2017. So I get that it sounds expensive, but I actually think the iPhone Air has a decent chance of selling compared at least to the 16 Plus. I just don't think it's going to be in the tech circles. I think we're the more likely demographic to care about cameras and battery life, but in a sense, I'm grateful for the iPhone Air's existence because now it allows the pros to get uglier, but way more utility focused. I'm glad they've gotten thicker. I'm glad they're using aluminum, and I'm glad we've got vapor chambers finally. So,
which ironically, you like that they're using aluminum on the pros, but you're now defending a product that's not using aluminum. So that's the only one that's like. I wonder if, for example, also looking at the design of the Air, if there is room for it to go aluminum unibody like the iPhone Pro and Max, right? Apple could do maybe a thin layer of titanium inside it, maybe make it overall like 6 millimeters thin, which I already made the point several times why a 10% improvement, like increase in thickness, could actually make several internal components like 20% larger, 30% larger. So yeah, there's plenty of room. Plus, of course, it has its own accessories like that MagSafe battery. I think this device will do relatively well. Maybe Apple will need to find ways to either increase its value or reduce its price or just redesign it and completely change its core appeal in some ways. But I do believe it has a future.
Battery life, but in a sense, I'm grateful for the iPhone Air's existence because now it allows the pros to get uglier, but way more utility focused. I'm glad they've gotten thicker. I'm glad they're using aluminum, and I'm glad we've got vapor chambers finally, so overheating shouldn't be as big of an issue if you're part of that techie demographic. But how do you guys feel about the lineup as a whole? Do you think Apple is justified in their feature cutting for the iPhone Air versus the Pro? You miss the old days where they would give all the best features and all the best aesthetics to the higher end iPhone? Feel free to let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and thank you to everybody supporting this channel directly. Seriously, helps us out a ton, as does just watching these videos, so thanks.
And I want to say the same. Thank you for just watching these videos, but also finding ways to support us directly. Again, super chats, super stickers. I do want to be wrapping this up because I am actually feeling a little bit sick, which is not great, but because I did have some nice plans over the week and I also plan to stream more. I'll let you know if this impacts me in any way. So let's see. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. I'll give you Big Mark one last time before I go off. I'll have to see when the next stream will be, because that will depend on when we get like hands-on impressions of the iPhone, first reviews, and then of course hopefully I'll actually end up holding it in my own hand together with AirPods Pro 3 on Friday. So hit the notification bell here on YouTube. That way you actually know when I'm going live. Shout out again to our Discord, where you get a lot more of me in general and a lot of my news and impressions. And of course, just let me know what else you would like to see me cover next. Thank you so much. I'll catch you then. This is Mark Tech, tuning out.